slow. Today is a big day. Why? Because we're going to be talking about ancient Mesopotamian literature. So my goal with this video is to introduce to you my favorite pieces of Mesopotamian literature. So my favorite stories basically from ancient Mesopotamia. And I'm going to divide this video up into 4 different sections, and the literature recommendations are going to be at the last section. And the reason for that is because I wanted to make this video in a way that if you don't know a lot about ancient Mesopotamia and the people that lived there, or if you don't know anything at all, then hopefully the first sections can help you fully enjoy the literature. Because really, in order to have fun with the literature, you kind of got to understand the people that it's coming from, right? And so my hope is that all of the things that you need to know in order to really get the most out of the stories I'm going to recommend to you, you'll be able to get throughout this video. So I'm going to give you a quick little rundown of the sections that I decided on. So the first section is just going to be a quick summary of the history of ancient Mesopotamia, and I made a timeline for this video that can maybe help you keep everything in chronological order in your mind, because there's a lot of history, right? It's like 3,000 years of history. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a quick outline of it in the history section, and then in the second section it's going to be focused on the religion of the ancient Mesopotamians, because a lot of their stories are dealing with their gods and goddesses and such. And so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of their religion so that you can better understand who a lot of the characters are in the stories that I'm going to introduce to you later on. And then the third section, technically you don't need the third section to, understand the literature, but one thing that I have been having so much fun learning so much about and reading so much stuff on is the development of cuneiform, which what the third section is going to be. The third section is going to be about the writing system that the ancient Mesopotamians had. After that is finally the ancient Mesopotamian literature recommendations. So I'm just going to be recommending to you again the ones that I enjoy the most, and hopefully that you will also enjoy, or you could just find some that sound interesting to you, or if you've already read a bunch, maybe you will find one that you haven't read or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm really excited. I've been spending so much time reading a bunch of stuff about ancient Mesopotamia. I've been spending weeks, and I just want to keep reading, but I got to make this video at some point. So let's get started and jump into the first section. So I might have lied just a little bit, because I'm going to show you the geography of ancient Mesopotamia first before we jump into the history. But it'll be quick, I promise. So I made a map, and in terms of, where's the distance measurements? Listen, we're not scholars here, okay? It's just a fun map, okay? I know you're supposed to have measurements for maps, but let's just pretend that you don't need them, okay? So if something is not like perfectly accurate, spare me. I'm sorry. Spare me, okay? But anyway, so on my map, you'll see the area that's designated as Mesopotamia. So it would be in like modern Iraq, parts of Syria, parts of Kuwait, and the such. The area that lies between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which come out of the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf, the coastline was more inland back then than it is today. So the coast on my map is going to be farther into the land than it would be on a modern map. Just keep that in mind. Also, I think that the rivers themselves are in different locations as of today. I think that they've changed that. So this is an ancient Mesopotamia map, okay? Not a modern Near East map. And then to the east are the Zagros Mountains. To the west is like the Arabian Desert. And then, you know, there's a bunch of other areas I'm sure you can identify, like Egypt, the Mediterranean Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the such. So that is a general layout of where ancient Mesopotamia is so that you can have it like laid out in your head. And I'll try to make the map make as much sense as possible. I'll do my best in editing Danny, okay? If she doesn't do the best, don't blame me, blame editing Danny. It's not my fault, it's hers, okay? So let's get on now to the timeline. All right, so for my timeline, I'm having it start at 3500 BC, and then it's gonna go all the way to 539 BC. So the reason for this timeline is that this means that all of the literature that I'm going to be recommending to you comes from within this time period, which is a very large amount of time. It's like 3,000 years. The beginning of my timeline I've put as 3500 BC. The reason I put 3500 BC is, for me, 3500 BC is going to represent the beginning of Sumerian pictorial writing. Now, I read a ton of stuff for this video, and to me, it seems like nobody knows when pictorial writing actually started, which is fine. I mean, it was like 5,000 years ago. I don't expect anyone to know, but a lot of sources say different things. So I have decided to just set the beginning of pictorial writing at 3500 BC. In Mesopotamia at this time, you have the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, and they arrive in Mesopotamia. Again, I don't think anyone really knows when, because I saw a lot of sources claiming that they arrived close to around 5000 BC or even 7000 BC, and I saw some sources claiming that they arrived right before 3500 BC when they started developing pictorial writing. So I'm not sure when they actually arrived, but that is before my timeline, so it doesn't matter, okay? They are by 3500 BC, by the beginning of our timeline for this video, they are in Mesopotamia. And no one knows where they came from. There's a lot of theories about where they might have come from, but nobody really knows. And specifically, the language, the Sumerian language, has no identifiable connection to any known language. So it's kind of this isolate language. And so nobody really knows where they came from or what other types of people they have a connection to, which is why you'll find a lot of, certain theories about them. Now, I have to say, these Sumerians are, okay, I know this probably is not how they actually looked, but the way that Sumerians depicted themselves in their art is so cute. It's so cute. I know, realistically, they probably didn't look like that. But in my head, I have been having so much fun just imagining these little bitty people who have like no necks just walking around southern Mesopotamia, and I just think it's hilarious for some reason. I don't know. I just think it's cute. Of course, not all their art is representing them like that. Like, these are all Sumerians. These here are all Sumerians, albeit different time periods. These are pretty old. Like, these are from these are like older ones, like around 3500 BC. This one's much later. I've just been having fun imagining them actually looking like that. So the Sumerians, like I said, they predominantly lived in southern Mesopotamia, and they're just, the name Sumerians is, they're a group of people. They didn't have, one unified country or anything in southern Mesopotamia. And then, of course, with the rise of the urbanization of Uruk, which this is credited, again, according to current archaeological evidence at least, as being the world's first city. And so you have the rise of Uruk, and then you have the rise of a lot of other cities around southern Mesopotamia. And what you end up having is a bunch of city-states. So little kingdoms here and there. And of course you'll have, some city-states conquering other city-states. There was a lot of war. This wasn't a peaceful time by any means, even though I like to picture the Sumerians wobbling around in peace. It's definitely farthest from the truth. There is a piece of sculpture, I guess you call it, carving, that is in really small fragments that we have today, or archaeologists have today. But it really says a lot, even from the little amounts of it that have survived. And it's called the Stele of the Vultures. So the Stele of the Vultures is depicting the victory of the people of the city-state of Lagash over the people of the city-state of Umma. And the people, these two city-states, had a very, very, very bitter rivalry. And you see in this Lagash winning over Umma, and it just brings me back down to earth every time I see it, because it is a very gruesome depiction very early on in human civilization of war. All right, so the next event on my timeline is 2350 BC. This date is important because it's the beginning of what's known as the Akkadian Empire. So, like I said, in southern Mesopotamia, you have the Sumerians, but also in northern Mesopotamia around this time, you have the Akkadians. So in 2350 BC, you have a man named Sargon the Great, at least that's what he became known as, and he was Akkadian, and he would go on to conquer not just all of northern Mesopotamia, but also go down south and conquer all of southern Mesopotamia. He would end up controlling all of Mesopotamia, and he is credited with creating the world's first empire. So the Akkadians spoke a different language than the Sumerians. So the Sumerians spoke Sumerian and the Akkadians spoke Akkadian. And Akkadian is a Semitic language, so it's linked to other languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. And the reason they became called the Akkadians was because Sargon the Great developed a city in northern Mesopotamia called Akkad. Now the next event is in 2150 BC, and this is the end of the Akkadian Empire. So I don't think there is a lot of certainty as to how the Akkadian Empire ended, because it seemed that the fall was quite sudden. From what I understand, there are numerous ideas as to the different causes that led to the downfall of the Akkadian Empire. I think the two biggest ones, which are the ones I'll mention, was that the Gutians, a type of barbaric people, they came and they conquered the Akkadians and led to them losing their power in Mesopotamia. But what led to the Akkadian Empire becoming weak enough to allow the Gutians to come in and conquer them? Well, there's a lot of speculation that there was a drought that significantly weakened the Akkadian Empire, and a drought that during this time had devastating consequences for tons of people, not just the Mesopotamians, but they speculate this might have caused the end of the Old Kingdom in Egypt and the end of one of the civilizations in the Indus Valley. I don't remember what its name was, like starts with an H or something. So they speculate that at this time, for multiple years, there was a really devastating drought which weakened a lot of empires, which, if that's the case and it weakened the Akkadian Empire, then that would have allowed the Gutians to then come in and conquer them. So you have the end of the Akkadian Empire, and basically Mesopotamia goes back to being ruled by a bunch of little kingdoms here and there. And you have the Lagash dynasty. So the rulers of Lagash, which this is a ruler of Lagash from the Lagash dynasty. Gudea is his name. There's a lot of surviving figurines just like this, which I think is really cool. There's tons of figurines from the Lagash dynasty that you can find. Significantly, is actually not the Lagash dynasty, this video. It is the dynasty that comes after the Lagash dynasty, which is the third dynasty of Ur. On my timeline, I'm going to put that as 2112 BC, 2112 BC is the start of the third dynasty of Ur. By the way, also quickly, again, a lot of sources say different dates for things, so I just went with the date that seemed best, okay? So 2112 BC for the beginning of the third dynasty of Ur with King Ur-Nammu. So the third dynasty of Ur officially begins when the rulers of Ur, which is a city-state, conquer the Lagash dynasty. And so the rulers from Ur, the third dynasty of Ur, becomes the main power in southern Mesopotamia. And the reason why this is significant is because it's been labeled as, I would see basically sources label it as a kind of Sumerian renaissance in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians are back in power, and so you see the continuation of Sumerian stories, Sumerian writings, just Sumerian culture. You get a lot of artwork as well from this period, and sadly though, it doesn't last for very long. In 2004 BC, you have the fall of the third dynasty of Ur. So the Amorites and the Gutians, these two groups of people, move into Mesopotamia, and again, Mesopotamia is now made up of little kingdoms here and there. In 1900 BC is the next date on my timeline, which is the beginning of the Old Babylonian period. So the beginning of the Babylonians. How the Babylonians come about in Mesopotamia. The Amorites start, setting up little kingdoms here and there. You would have an Amorite king in this one kingdom, and then another Amorite king in another kingdom, and there was a line of Amorite rulers who ruled from the city of Babylon. They ruled from Babylon, and they created a very successful empire, and that is why they're now known as Babylonians. But the original kings were Amorites. This would later change, I'll explain it later. But I'm sure there are kings from here that you've heard of, like Hammurabi with his code of laws. That's, I'm sure is very recognizable for a lot of you. He was an Amorite king from this old Babylonian period. And Hammurabi, specifically out of these kings, would go on to conquer all of Mesopotamia. And he would create a very large and powerful Babylonian empire. But as is typical, when he dies and his successors come along, they're not really able to maintain it. And so eventually their empire falls. Specifically, you have a group of people known as the Hittites who come along the Euphrates, and they start raiding a bunch of city-states. But the thing is that they would raid these city-states, take everything they wanted, and then eventually they leave. So they don't stay and rule and conquer. They just raid these cities and then leave. So this kind of creates a power vacuum in Mesopotamia, because you have these Babylonians in power, and then the Hittites come in and take over all their cities, raid everything, and then just leave. So now who's going to fill the space? So you have another group known as the Kassites who come in and take over Babylon. So then the next date on my timeline is 1600 BC, which is the beginning of the Middle Dynasty of Babylon, or also called the Kassite Dynasty of Babylon. So now the next date on my timeline is 1363 BC, and this is significant because it's going to introduce us to the other group of people in Mesopotamia that are important for this video, which are the Assyrians. So in 1363 BC, the Assyrians gained their independence from the Mitanni kingdom. And the Assyrians were people that lived in the city-state of Ashur. And the Assyrians would go on to not just conquer all of Mesopotamia, but they would create a very extensive empire. And the only period of their empire that I'm going to put on my timeline is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which started in 912 BC. So this is when their empire is really at its height, and so that's what I'm going to include from their empire on my timeline. And then, quick note, they would go on to change their capital during the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So the capital was not in Ashur anymore. They changed it to Nimrud, and then they eventually also changed it to Nineveh. Then eventually the Babylonians actually come back in power, and this is the last period of the Babylonian Empire that I'm going to have on my timeline. We're getting to the end of my timeline, I swear. So the next date on my timeline is 629 BC, which is the start of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or you could also call it the Chaldean Dynasty. And this is when the Babylonians come back in power. So the first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was Nabopolassar. He went, and because of all of the political unrest that was happening within the Assyrian Empire towards the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, he was able to go in and take the city of Babylon. When he does this, he becomes the first ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And I'm sure there are kings from the Neo-Babylonian Empire that some of you probably heard before. I mean, you might have already heard of Nabopolassar before, but I think the most famous one is Nebuchadnezzar, who is the son of Nabopolassar and the second ruler of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty or empire. He's technically Nebuchadnezzar the second. There was a first Nebuchadnezzar in the Kassite dynasty, but the one that everyone knows of is the Nebuchadnezzar from the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So the very last date on my timeline, we're finally at the end, is 539 BC, which I mentioned at the very beginning. This is when the Neo-Babylonian Empire falls. And also, the reason it falls is because a Persian, Cyrus the Great, comes in and conquers Mesopotamia. So that's the end of my timeline. For now, we are going to add some things as the video progresses, but in terms of the history, that is it. I wanted to include this because I think that it helps you understand the literature better and gets you a general idea of what is going on within this really big time span. So now let's get into the next section, which is the religious section. All right, well, welcome to the religious section of this video. This section is going to probably be the shortest because I'm just going to give you an overview of the Mesopotamian religion just so that you can have a general idea of who the gods and goddesses are, because if you don't really know anything about them, I think that it probably makes reading Mesopotamian literature far less enjoyable because they do play a really dominant part in their literature. So I'm going to tell you just the most important gods and goddesses that I think you should know about in order to have a much easier time reading Mesopotamian literature. Even though there's like 3,000 years of time passing, the religion of the Sumerians was really fundamental to the rest of Mesopotamian history, and it really laid the foundations for thousands of years of religious practices and religious beliefs, which of course just further aids why the Sumerians are my bias and why they're the best. But regardless, I'm going to tell you their Sumerian name and their Akkadian name, because a lot of the gods of the original Sumerians go on to exist with the rest of the civilizations in Mesopotamia. They would just typically have different names or sometimes kind of become absorbed into another god. The first three that I'll put together to mention are An, or Anu is also what he's called, Enlil, also known as Bel, and Enki, also known as Ea. So An/Anu, he is the god of heaven, and Enlil is the god of the atmosphere, and then Enki is the god of water, but specifically he's the god of fresh water. And An is supposedly the most powerful god of the pantheon, like Sumerian pantheon, but I think that when you read the literature specifically, it doesn't seem that way. It really seems like Enlil is the most prominent god when you read Mesopotamian literature, and I think that's because, so An is the god of heaven, and Enlil is given dominion over the earth, and so he plays a much bigger role in terms of what happens to humans and in dealing with humans. So I assume that that's why when you read literature, Enlil seems like the far more superior and dominant god than Anu. That's my assumption, I don't know, but a lot of times you'll also see that Enlil, when it comes to humans, will make decisions, and Enki is the one who will act out those decisions. And I'm also going to tell you kind of signs and symbols that you can look for in art to identify these gods, because I think it's really fun. So with Enki specifically, you will commonly see him with water streaming out from both sides of him. And also, okay, all of the gods have these horned caps on their head, like these horned crown thingies, which is really helpful because when you're looking at pieces of art, if you ever see a creature or a human that has that cap of horns, I don't don't even really know what it is, but I guess it's like a horned cap. If you ever see that, that means that that being is divine, which is really, really helpful and really nice when you're looking at pieces of art and stuff, because it really helps you identify them quickly. There's these land grants known as kudarus, and they are really cool because they contain a lot of symbols of gods, and so you can kind of look at them and like, you know, get your magnifying glass and like figure out who's who. So on these, Enki is typically identified by an aquatic animal, such like a turtle, or there will be a ram-headed column, and then at the bottom there will be a fish-tailed Capricorn. And then the next three that I'll tell you about are the astral deities. So the first one is Inanna, also known as Ishtar. She is the goddess of war and love, but more specifically sexual love. She's typically identified as a Venus. She's also very heavily linked to fertility, and her signs are an 8-pointed star. She's also represented by lions. Then later during the Assyrian Empire, you can see her represented with stars that are in a circle around her. And then the next astral god is Nanna, also known as Sin. He is the moon god, and he is commonly referenced with a crescent moon. The last one is Utu, also known as Shamash, and he is the sun god. You can commonly see him represented by a blazing sun symbol. Also see him in like human form. He'll commonly have a jagged edged is what I meant to say, jagged edged dagger, and he'll have these like blazing sun rays coming out from behind him. And you'll also commonly see him somehow situated on mountains, so like on top of the mountain or in between the mountain. The next two I'm going to put in conjunction with each other, and that is Ereshkigal and Nergal. Ereshkigal is the goddess of the underworld. I think she's also typically identified as Inanna's sister. I'm not going to tell you relations, by the way, between gods and goddesses. I think it'd just be really confusing if I tried to do that, because depending on what time period it is, a lot of the relations change. And so sometimes someone could be someone's brother or someone's father, and then like it'll constantly change depending on the story. So honestly, in terms of who's related to who, I don't think it's really necessary to know that. So Ereshkigal is commonly the sister of Inanna, but she's the goddess of the underworld, or the queen of the underworld. And then Nergal is also the god of the underworld. They eventually would rule the underworld together. I'll also mention Adad. He's not super prominent in a lot of the stories, but his name does come up quite a bit, so I'll just tell you who he is so you don't get confused. But he is the god of like thunderstorms. So if you see a thunderbolt, that is commonly a reference to him. The next one is Dumuzid, also known as Dumuzi, and then in Akkadian it's Tammuz, and he is the shepherd god. His main role is the lover or spouse of Inanna. All right, the last two I'm going to mention are specific to the Babylonians and the Assyrians. So these gods did not exist to the Sumerians. First one is Marduk. So he was the patron deity of Babylon, thus he became the main central god to the Babylonians. You'll still see Anu and Enlil referenced in Babylonian literature, but in terms of their prominence, it really gets pushed aside, and Marduk becomes the main god, because obviously since he was the patron deity of Babylon, when Babylon becomes such a big powerhouse, it's because of him. So he is commonly seen referenced with a triangular shaped spear, and then he's also commonly seen with a dragon that has a how do you say it? Forked, that's the word. A forked tongue at the end. Now, the last god that I'll tell you about is Ashur. He is specific to the Assyrians. So like Marduk was the main god for the Babylonians, Ashur was the main god for the Assyrians. So Ashur was the god of war, and he was the patron deity of the city of Ashur, which was the capital originally for the Assyrian Empire. He can be commonly seen in a like winged disc type of thing. You'll see him with weapons on him. You'll see him with stars around him. These are the only gods that you gotta like keep a lookout for, because they'll come up quite often. Well, actually, I don't think Asher comes up at all now that I think about it. But you know what? As the patron deity of Asher, big deity to the Assyrians, I had to mention him anyway. Because yeah, now that I think about it, I don't think any of the literature I recommend has Asher in it. But at least you know about him. Okay, at least you know about him. The last thing I'll mention for the religious section are the ziggurats. So Mesopotamians believed that each city had a patron deity, which I think this is so cool. But they basically believed that a god or goddess would create a city, and that city was meant to be their earthly dwelling place, their earthly home. And so each city would have a temple that was dedicated to that patron deity, and this temple they had to take care of and constantly give sacrifices, because they believed that that god would live there in their earthly dwelling place. And in the third dynasty of these temples start to take the shape of what is now called a ziggurat, and the gods were thought to inhabit the highest level on the ziggurat. And in terms of the best example of a ziggurat that we have today is the one in but this is a reconstruction of the ziggurat, and it's not complete. So the ziggurat that we have today that we can look at, this isn't what it actually would have looked like completely, but it has been reconstructed quite significantly. But most of these ziggurats that have been found are just basic remains. I mean, that doesn't look like a ziggurat at all. In these ziggurats, they had to constantly give sacrifices. Sacrifices were a very vital part of their religion, and they believed that if they did not give everything to the gods to please them and to make their time on earth comfortable, that they would be punished, and that the gods would take their favor away from them, and thus their whole city would be destroyed. All right, so that's it for the religious section, and now we can get into the cuneiform section. Welcome to the cuneiform section of this video. I originally just, I was gonna do a little section I had planned on writing, because they are credited with creating the first writing script, and I thought that went hand in hand with literature, so I was gonna do a little section, but I ended up becoming so obsessed with learning about the cuneiform writing system, but more specifically the development of cuneiform, and I don't know why, I just found it so interesting. So I'm going to try to make this section as small as possible, okay? I'm not going to share everything that I've learned. I'm going to try to keep it concise. I don't know how long that will be, but I'm going to go a little in depth, but not like crazy in depth or anything. I doubt I even have a very in-depth knowledge on it at all, but I just wanted to share what I've learned in terms of the development of cuneiform. So hopefully you like it. Hopefully you're excited about it as well. Okay, so again, what are the dates? I really struggled to decide what dates to put on my timeline for writing, because they are all over the place. Nobody says the same thing. And so the dates that I have decided to put on my timeline, just take this as like, it was around this time, okay? As I already said, 3500 BC is the beginning of pictorial writing. Now, I'm going to make cuneiform writing start at 2900 BC. This is such a, listen, I don't know. We're gonna put it at 2900 BC. Most people say it's really confusing. I guess it depends on what your definition of a fully fledged cuneiform writing system is, I don't know. Some people say it's in like 3200, and some people say it's not until like late in the 200s that they start. I don't know. I'm putting it as 2900. That's my decision. 2900 is on the date on my timeline, okay? So I'm going to start explaining to you pictorial writing, and then once I do that, I will explain to you how pictorial writing developed into cuneiform writing, because I think it's really cool. So I'll explain it to you in the best of my ability. Bear with me, okay? So pictorial writing, Assyriologists believe that writing first was invented in the city of Uruk, which I've said before is kind of considered like the first big city, you know? So with the rise of Uruk, with the rising population, the rise of an urbanization of the city, you have a need for documentation. So while archaeologists see evidence of Uruk becoming a larger and larger city, they at the same time see evidence of a writing system, of things starting to be written down. So a lot of the early documents, I say a lot, 100% basically, of all of the early documents are for administration purposes or commercial purposes, and pictorial writing in particular. Pictorial writing is very limited in what you can write down with it, what you can portray in writing with it. So what is pictorial writing? Pictorial writing is the use of pictograms, so the use of signs to represent an object or a meaning. So I'll give you some examples that you can find very commonly on tablets that have survived, on clay tablets that have survived. There's one for an ox, there's another for a cow, there's one for a man. One you'll see a lot of is for barley or like grain. You'll see one that has like a face and a bowl, which can be used separately, but also when they're put together, it means like food rations. A foot is, I've seen it say that it means that it can mean multiple things. It can mean that someone is going somewhere, someone is standing somewhere, someone will go somewhere, stuff like that. There's so many. There's one for a bird, there's one for a fish, there's a lot. And one thing that I had so much fun while doing this, while learning it, was when I'm like out and about doing things, I've just been like looking around, you know, I'm looking around now for the things that we use that are basically pictograms, like the same stuff. Like we do the same stuff today, right? And every time I see one now, I don't know why, but you know, these basic signs that I'm used to seeing my whole life, now when I see them, I get kind of like, ooh, like I feel like a connection with the Sumerians, you know? Like I feel a connection. I don't know why, I don't know, but whenever I see them now, I just feel so excited because it's like we're using the same thing that these people thousands and thousands of years ago used. And I feel like, you know, we're friends. I feel like we're friends. I don't know. So examples of what I mean is like for restrooms, you know how you see signs of a man, sign of a woman. Like you can look at that and you know that means, oh, that's a man, oh, that's a woman, or oh, that's handicap. Like that's what that means. Or like a pedestrian sign, you know, you just see a person, like a figure walking, and you know, oh, that means that like people can be walking around here. So if this is helping you better understand it, pictorial writing is basically writing that you don't need to speak a certain language to learn it, right? Like you don't need to speak English to look at a sign of a female and know that that's a female. Like you can speak any language. So it's kind of like writing that anyone can understand, you know, because it doesn't represent sound. It doesn't mimic speech. I get excited in my car because literally in your car, everything is like pictograms. Literally you got the engine light. Not that my engine light came on or anything. Don't worry. But you got like the engine light, like the oil light, or like you have like the vent signs, like, oh, I want my air to come through the vents at the top, or oh, I want the air to come through the vents at the bottom. Like you just press a sign. Like it doesn't have any words. You just look at it and you're like, oh. But now I look at it and I'm like, oh, Sumerians. You know what I'm saying? It's really exciting. I should mention that around the time that the Sumerians have pictorial writing, they're starting to write pictograms, communicate with pictograms. You do have a little bit later a lot of other civilizations coming up with writing systems too. I think it's really interesting that a lot of civilizations created writing scripts around the same time. I don't know, like you have hieroglyphics in Egypt quickly after this. You have a writing script in the Indus Valley, and I think the next would probably have been in China in the late Shang Dynasty, and then the only other one I can think of is in Mesoamerica, but that was pretty later, like 900 BC or something like that. But really exciting. Now, I know I've been terming it pictorial writing, but pictorial writing technically isn't, the real definition of writing. I guess if you want to define writing as signs that represent speech, then cuneiform is real writing. And it is cuneiform that is deemed the first writing script, because cuneiform is full of signs that represent sound. Just like A is ah, it represents sounds. So I'm going to explain how the transition happened from pictorial writing to cuneiform. I'm going to explain both how they started the transition from using signs to represent an object and making that transition to using signs to represent a sound. And then the second thing that I'll explain about the transition is how they got from the symbols of pictorial writing to the symbols that you see in cuneiform. So I'm going to explain both transitions. I'm going to start with the first one. When they were writing pictograms and the people who could write were called scribes, they started noticing something that's called the rebus principle, which we still use today. I'll give you an example in English so that it makes more sense. Let's say I use some raindrops to indicate the word rain. That's a pictogram, right? But let's say I'm writing a sentence like, the reign of King Charles. Reign sounds the same as the reign of my pictogram, but it has a different meaning. But what they realized was that you could use that picture, the pictogram that you have, since it sounds the same, you could use it to also mean that other type of reign. So you're basically taking advantage of homonyms. You could also make bigger words with this, like you could combine them, so you could do like rainbow. In order to write rainbow, you could use the sign for rain and a sign for bow and put them together. Or you could do butterfly, so you could put a picture of butter and then a picture of a fly. I'll give you an example that I found. I don't speak Sumerian, sorry, so I had to find some examples in Sumerian. So they would have a pictograph for water. So they had an established pictograph that they used for water, just like two little squiggly lines, right? But water in Sumerian sounds like ah. But also, if you say ah, it could mean in. So they realized that they could use the symbol for water, the pictogram for water, and use it to indicate in, because in terms of pictograms, right, how do you write the word in? Like this, it can be kind of hard to portray. So they could take a pictogram that's simple to portray, that sounds the same, and use it to represent the sound of that other word. So you see how they realized and made that change into starting to use signs to represent sounds. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the second type of transition that I talked about, which is the look of the symbols. So how did that transition happen? Now I'm going to focus on Proto-Cuneiform to explain this. Proto-Cuneiform is basically the type of cuneiform that they used that led up into the mature script. So it's the foundation of cuneiform, but not the fully developed cuneiform writing system. And I'm going to take cow. I'm going to use the symbol for cow, and that's going to be the one that I'm going to show you step by step how it changed. I'm going to show you the final form of cow, and I'm going to explain to you how that changed was made. Okay. Now I'm going to focus on two categories of proto-cuneiform, which are termed Uruk 4 and Uruk 3. So Uruk 4 represents the script in 3200 BC, and Uruk 3 represents the script in 3100 BC, so like 100 years later. And I really like this classification that they've made because I think that it really helps show the changes that they were making that would become fundamental aspects of the cuneiform script. I'll put the original sign of cow, I'll put it as 3500 BC. The only thing that's changed is in Uruk 4, you see a directional change. So the sign for cow has changed by 90 degrees. The reason for this is because they originally were reading up and down, and then they changed to reading left and right. The main thing is the change from Uruk 4 to Uruk 3. So if we look at Uruk 3, there are things that we can point out. So the first is, as you can see, there's these little wedges that are being used now that weren't being used in Uruk 4. So in Uruk 4, they were using a pointed stylus. In Uruk 3, they have changed to using a reed stylus with a triangular shaped cross section, so a triangular shaped end. They would take this triangular ended stylus and they would press it into the clay, so it would create a little triangle and then a little line. And so you can see that all of the little lines are wedges, and this is crucial to all of cuneiform. This wedge-shaped little lines are going to be used for thousands of years for the rest of the cuneiform writing script. The second that you can see is in Uruk 3, the lines are much more straight. So in Uruk 4, you have a lot of curvature, but with transitioning to a reed stylus that has a triangular shaped end, it would be very difficult to make curved lines with that. So they go to just having straight lines. The next one is you can start to see in Uruk 3, it's becoming a little abstract. Now, if I look at Uruk 3, I can kind of be like, yeah, I see the cow. But say I bring back that Neo-Assyrian symbol, I can't tell that that's a cow, right? And so Uruk 3 kind of shows you how the signs are starting to become more and more abstract to where they get to a point where by looking at it, you would never know where that sign originated from or how it evolved. They don't look like real objects anymore. So now I'm going to show you the cow sign in the full entirety. So from the very beginning until the very end of the, when cuneiform has become the most simplified that it will ever be, which I have put as Neo-Assyrian, so around 700 BC. So to remind you, the first one is going to be 3500 BC. The second is going to be 3200 BC, then 3100 BC. Then I'm going to show you what it looked like around 2000 BC, so around the end of Ur 3, the third dynasty of Ur, to the beginning of the Old Babylonian Empire. And then I'll show you around 700 BC, so around the Neo-Assyrian Empire. You can see the gradual change from what it looked like originally to where it ended up. And you see this with a lot of them. I will show you a few more. Let's see. Which ones do I want to make editing Danny put on the screen? I'll show you the one also for maybe, I showed you cow. There's one for an ox or like a bull. I could show you that one. The transition from 3500 to 700. I could show you the transition for a star. I could show you a transition for the water one that I showed you earlier. Okay, good. All right, let's move on. The next thing I want to talk about, I was kind of debating if I should talk about it because I don't know if people find it interesting, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway because I'm sure some of you will find it interesting. Okay, but the next thing I want to talk about is the functions that signs could have. So I know that I said with cuneiform you have signs that represent sounds, right? But it's not like all of a sudden now every single sign only represents a sound, and that's it. That's that simple. Cuneiform is definitely not simple. The whole time I was reading all up on all of this and learning all of this, the gratitude that I have for Assyriologists, people who have devoted their lives to learning cuneiform, and not just learning cuneiform, but then learning the different languages that used cuneiform, like learning how to read Akkadian and learning how to read Sumerian. My gratitude went up immensely because it's a lot. Let's get into the different functions that a sign can have. If you're interested, let's get started with that. A sign could have 3 different functions. The first one is that the sign could be a syllabogram. The second is that a sign could be a logogram. And third is that a sign could be a classifier or a determinative. So I'll explain what each of these mean. So when it comes to a sign functioning as a syllabogram, that means that the sign represents a syllable. And they had 4 different types of syllables. So they had a vowel, a consonant vowel, a vowel consonant, or a consonant vowel consonant. So that would be, you could have the sound eh, you could have the sound et, you could have the sound te, and you could have the sound tet. As you might be able to guess by now, they had to have a lot of signs because there's a lot of syllables. So like for us, we can have ah, we can have ta. They would have at, et, it, te, ta, te, tu, tat, pet. And if you remember the most simplified version of cuneiform, which is around 700, in the most simplified and efficient cuneiform system they developed, there was about 600 different signs that you would have to learn. And 600 is when it was the most simplified. There were many years where they would have to learn minimum 900 different signs in order to write cuneiform. Let's go to the second function though. Let's move to the second one. The second one was logograms. So logograms never went away, obviously. I think they kind of exist in every language. Don't quote me on that. But, if I think about it, we all have logograms, right? So this is, like I've already explained, basically, you have a sign and it means a word. Logogram. It's a logo. So I've already explained all the logogram stuff. Now the last one is a classifier or a determinative. So this basically means that they would use a sign and they would place it before or after a word in order to clarify more about that word. So for example, in front of a divine name, they would put a star in front of it. So if you were writing, say you're a scribe back in the day, you got your clay tablet and your reed stylus and you're writing, and you're writing a story about the goddess Inanna, because why wouldn't you want to do that? You're writing a good old story about the courageous, ambitious Inanna. Well, every time you write Inanna, you want to make it clear that Inanna is a divine being. You would attach to it in the beginning, so it would be a determinative. You would attach the sign for God. So this indicates when someone's reading the tablet, when they read Inanna, they would read that sign beforehand and they would know, oh, this means that name, Inanna, is the divine name. It belongs to a divine being. So a determinative would be a sign that would be used before, a classifier would be used after. You also would not pronounce these. If you were reading a tablet out loud, you would not pronounce the star. I think the word was digir, because in the original pictogram, it meant star, but it also meant divine being. And so that would continue to be used as a symbol for a divine being. And I think that was digir, something like that. In Sumerian, of course, it would be different depending on what language you're speaking. So a symbol could have any of those 3 functions. Now, of course, since cuneiform is just so beautifully complex, some signs could have all 3 functions. And in terms of knowing which one it is, I assume that it's based on context. So when you're reading something, if you come across a sign that does have all those 3 functions, you would be able to determine what function it is using based on context. That's my assumption. I have no experience reading Sumerian or Akkadian, so that's my assumption. Another complexity is that a sign could have numerous different sounds. Again, my assumption is that when someone's reading this and they come across a sign that has multiple different sounds, that can represent multiple different sounds, my assumption is that based on context, that is how they would determine which sound that symbol is representing in that sentence. And if you ever come across any transliterations, which Assyriologists, when they're translating something, they'll do like a transliteration first. If you ever look at any transliterations, which you can easily find them, but if you look at them, you're most likely going to see a plethora of subscripts. And what these subscripts mean is that when a sign has multiple different sounds that it represents, Assyriologists will indicate which sound that sign is representing with a subscript. Now, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to spare you any more. Well, I have more to say about cuneiform, but I'm going to end it there in terms of talking about the script itself, technically. We're ending it there, okay? Hopefully that made sense. I just had a lot of fun learning stuff about cuneiform recently, and I just wanted to share with you the transition from pictorial writing to cuneiform because I found it really interesting and I really liked it. So I'm just going to talk about a few cuneiform topics, basically, that I really enjoyed. The first one that I wanted to talk about is actually it's a clarification in terms of who was able to read and write. So in the next section, when we get to the literature section, I wanted to talk about who's actually writing these stories. So only a small portion of the population could read or write because, as I'm sure you've understood by now, cuneiform was very difficult. And you had to go to school and spend many, many years learning how to read and write cuneiform. And so only typically wealthy people could do so. And they would become known as scribes. It does make me kind of sad sometimes because I feel like there is such a huge portion of the population that's like out of reach because I can't read things that they thought and felt, and like they're far from me. But you know, at least we have somewhat of a link to them through the scribes and through what the scribes wrote down. So thank you, scribes. Thanks for writing stuff down. So majority of all of the stuff that you see, all the clay tablets that have survived, which are a lot of them, they're all written by scribes predominantly. Not all of them, but majority of them are. And if you were like a regular citizen and say you were making a transaction, a contract, anything like that, you would have a scribe write it for you. So as I've mentioned many times already, and I'm sure you've seen from pictures, is that they wrote majority of their stuff on clay tablets, which is why so many of their clay tablets have survived. In fact, there have been hundreds of thousands of tablets that have been found by archaeologists, which is crazy. And the reason that clay has lasted for so long is because when clay comes in contact with heat, it hardens. They would bake their clay to better preserve it, but not all the time. In fact, I think it was probably more common that they didn't put it in an oven and bake the clay, but just the heat in Mesopotamia in general helps heat up the clay and preserve it and dry it. And something that I think is really, really cool, and not that this happened all the time or anything, but you know, not that this is the majority of documents, but something that I think is really, really cool about clay and clay tablets and the nature of clay tablets is that something like fire, which is meant to be so destructive, right? Like when I think of fire, I think it like burns everything, it destroys everything. But when it comes to clay tablets, it better preserves them. There's a lot of tablets actually that archaeologists have found preserved because the building that they were in had been burnt down, like in a raid or something. And that act of burning down a house or a temple or a palace as a means of destroying these people actually helped their writings survive longer and document them better for people like us in the future who want to read about them, which I think is so cool. I think it's so interesting. Like, for example, there's a royal palace at Mari, and this palace was discovered by archaeologists. And when they discovered it, the walls were still standing. I think one of the people who went said like the highest walls were still up to 13 feet high, which is crazy because it was built thousands and thousands of years ago. But when Hammurabi was going around conquering all of Mesopotamia, he went to Mari and conquered Mari, and he took out all of the tablets that were in reference to him and dealt with him and his communications with the king. And then he burnt the whole palace and then destroyed it. Well, technically destroyed it, but really what he did is he better preserved all of those tablets that are in there. And so archaeologists were able to find over like 20,000 tablets at the royal palace of Mari because of that fire, which I just think that's so cool. I don't know. There's just something so cool about that. It's like fire's so destructive, but with clay tablets and these ancient civilizations, it's better preservation. Pretty cool. Now, if you want to learn more about how cuneiform was deciphered, I'm not going to go like super in depth in it, but you can look up the Behistun inscription, which is this really, really cool giant carving into the side of a mountain, which is kind of the I would see people refer to it as the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform, because it had written on it cuneiform writing script in 3 different languages. So it was Old Persian written in cuneiform, and then it was Elamite written in cuneiform, and then it was Akkadian written in cuneiform. So they were able to translate the Old Persian quite easily, and then eventually, because of that, they were able to translate the Akkadian cuneiform on there, which eventually led to them being able to translate Sumerian cuneiform. So Akkadian was translated first, which Akkadian being a Semitic language was helpful because it had roots to already known languages like Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic. They were able to translate Akkadian, and then they eventually, no one knew that the Sumerians existed, but through translating Akkadian, they were able to realize that a lot of these tablets were using some other kind of language, and there must have been some kind of language being written down before Akkadian. So they eventually were able to discover the Sumerian language and the Sumerians. So the Sumerians weren't even known until quite recently. There's so much on how cuneiform was deciphered, and if you want to learn more about that, you can. But you can always start by looking up at the Behistun inscription because it's pretty cool. And I love that it's carved into the side of a mountain. It's pretty awesome. Now, the last thing, actually wait. Okay, before I get to the last thing, I have to tell you about something that I thought was really cool, which are the envelopes. Cuneiform clay envelopes, okay? I don't know why I think it's so cool, and I don't know why I never realized it existed before, but for some reason, I guess I just never thought about it. Today, you can still find cuneiform clay tablets that have an envelope on them. I don't know why. I think it's so cool. I guess it's obvious. Maybe they would have envelopes, right? If you don't want what's inside to be known or something, I don't know, but I just think the envelopes are cool. But finally, the last thing that I'm going to talk about with cuneiform is something I'm going to put on my timeline. Just because, I don't know, I wanted to, okay? And that's going to be 669 BC, which is the beginning of the reign of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria. Now, the reason that I'm putting this on my timeline is because King Ashurbanipal, he made a huge library at Nineveh. This discovery of this huge library at Nineveh has helped with the further translation of a lot of stories that were previously very fragmented. Like, for example, the Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh was better completed because of King Ashurbanipal's library. And King Ashurbanipal, he was a king, but he also loved writing, and he boasted that he was able to read and write the old Sumerian language. Because once Akkadian took over in terms of a spoken language and Sumerian dies out, Sumerian would still persist as a written language. And it's kind of like Latin. You know how Latin stops being a spoken language, but people kept writing Latin. That's kind of the same case. People kept writing Sumerian. It was kind of a a prestigious language. Like if you know how to read and write Sumerian, you get, I don't know, intelligence kudos or something. It was kind of like that. They would still use Sumerian to write religious texts. King Ashurbanipal was very determined to create this huge library, and so he would write letters to people around Mesopotamia telling them, send me your tablets. Or he would send his scribes around Mesopotamia to collect tablets, copy tablets. He wanted as much Mesopotamian writing in his library as possible. So because of that, and because of his efforts and his love for writing, he helped preserve so many tablets for all of us thousands of years later. So thank you, King Ashurbanipal, even though you were terrifying, as all kings tend to be. Thanks. Thanks so much. And I think mentioning that he had his scribes copy a lot of stories is important, because I don't think I've mentioned this yet. The sources that exist today that have led to us being able to read their stories, most of them are copies. So usually for a certain story, obviously a lot of tablets are going to be broken up. Today, you're going to find them very fragmented. You're going to find parts of tablets just empty, shaven off, broken off. But what's helpful is that you can usually find multiple sources for the same story. And so say you have a story and you've translated as much as you can, but there's still so many pieces missing. Hopefully one day, amongst the hundreds of thousand tablets, hopefully one day you will find a tablet that is telling the same story and hopefully fills in the lines. So, like I said, there are hundreds of thousands of tablets that have been found, but only a very small percentage have been translated, because it's obviously, I feel that it must be a very big feat to translate all those documents, and I'm not sure how many people they have on board to do that around the world. But that is the end of the cuneiform, the writing system. And we are finally going to get into what literature is my favorite and what literature from them do I recommend you read. Let's go to the next section and find out. Alright, so welcome to the last section of this video, which is my recommendations for Mesopotamian literature. I've put these in categories more so that's how I'm going to do it. So the first category that I'm going to start with is creation stories. So these are stories that deal with the creation of the universe and of mankind. So the first one I'm going to start with is probably the most popular one, and that is the Enuma Elish. This is also known as the 7 Tablets of Creation, because the best preserved version of the story was found on 7 tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal. This is a Babylonian epic of creation, because the central god in this story is Marduk. So this story of creation has 3 different sections, and the first section deals with the creation of the gods, and I'll read you the very beginning, so how it starts, okay? It says, "When skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together, but had not formed pastures nor discovered reed beds. When yet no gods were manifested, nor names pronounced, nor destinies decreed, then gods were born within them." So it really is going to what they believe to be the very, very, very beginning times. So when the only 2 beings in creation are Apsu and Tiamat. And Apsu is basically a representation of the fresh waters, and Tiamat is a representation of the salt waters. And so in the very beginning, you just have Apsu and Tiamat in existence, and then the Enuma Elish starts to go into detail of how all the rest of the gods start to come into existence. And then the second section, like I said, there's 3. The second section deals with the battle between Marduk and Tiamat, and in this battle, Tiamat is basically a representation of chaos. So how Marduk is able to fight chaos. And then the last section deals with the creation of basically the universe, Earth, and mankind. And I really like the Enuma Elish. I think for a Mesopotamian piece of literature, it is very long and very detailed. And because of those 7 tablets, they were really well preserved. And so there's not a ton of fragmentation. And I think you can commonly even find sources that will just make it seem as if there's no fragmentation, so you can read it very smoothly. And I think it's really great. I really enjoy reading it, and I think it's a very enjoyable story about their belief of the creation of the universe, and Marduk, their main big personal god, becoming the central god and becoming so prominent within their pantheon and having dominance over all of the gods and all of creation. So I do think that out of all the creation stories, it probably is the best one that you could read. But there is another one, and that is the Epic of Atrahasis. So this one does begin before mankind, but the gods are already existing. So you have the gods described as the Anunnaki and the Agigi are the ones having to do all of the work, and they're not happy about this. You see how eventually this leads to mankind being created. And if you want to, of course, see more detail into how the Agigi's annoyance and anger at having to work so much leads to the creation of mankind, you could read the Epic of Atrahasis, of course. And this story also includes quite a bit of similar themes to the Enuma Elish. It's very different, but the reasoning for things can be quite similar, such as how the gods create mankind, like what man is made out of. So yeah, the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Atrahasis are the 2 that I most recommend for creation stories, but I do have 2 others that I will mention if you read those and you're still wanting to learn more. There's another story called Enki and Ninmah that you can read, and then there's a really little one that's called The Song of the Hoe, but I've also seen it called The Creation of the Pickaxe. So you can read those if you want more creation stories. The next category that I have is flood stories. So these are stories that reference a great flood that came and destroyed mankind. This is a very common event that is referenced in quite a lot of different Mesopotamian writings. And the first one that I'll mention is the most fragmented, which is called the Eridu Genesis. The reason it's called the Eridu Genesis is because there's a lot of prominence on Eridu, the city, and Enki, who is the patron deity of Eridu, hence the name Eridu Genesis, just in case, just so the name makes sense. This is a Sumerian story, and again, it's definitely the most fragmented and the shortest, but, well, it's short because it's fragmented. I don't know how long the original story was. A lot of the flood stories are very similar, so even though the Eridu Genesis is very fragmented, it is quite easy to understand what probably was written in those missing lines. But in the Eridu Genesis, the man who will end up surviving the flood is named Ziusudra. Now, the next story is one that I already mentioned, but I'm going to mention it again because it does also deal with the flood, and that is the Epic of Atrahasis. So the beginning of the Epic of Atrahasis deals with the creation of mankind, but towards the very end of the story, you also experience the gods sending a flood to destroy humans. And the Epic of Atrahasis is much more lengthy and detailed than the Eridu Genesis, and you see a lot more of the gods' reasoning for wanting to destroy mankind in the Epic of Atrahasis. Now, Atrahasis is basically the same person as Ziusudra. He is the man who survives the flood. So you could basically say Ziusudra is equal to Atrahasis. This is an Akkadian tale, so it's Akkadian name for the same man, basically. They're the same person because these stories are very similar. One thing that all of these stories will have in common is the reasoning for why the gods want to destroy mankind. And the Eridu Genesis doesn't really explain it that well, but the Epic of Atrahasis explains it a lot better because more of it survived. In kind of the middle of the story, the gods start to get very angry because there's too many people and they're making too much noise. And the country became too wide, the people too numerous. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their clamor. Enlil had to listen to their noise. He addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. To the Mesopotamians, the reason that the gods wanted to destroy mankind was because they were making too much noise, they were being too loud, they couldn't sleep, they couldn't rest, and so they wanted to send a flood and destroy mankind. Now, in the Epic of Atrahasis, it details that the gods did a lot of other things before they sent the flood. They specifically sent diseases and droughts to mankind before they eventually decided to just destroy them all with a flood. And Atrahasis is the one who survives. Now, the last story that I'll tell you for the flood myth, and probably the best preserved one, is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's specifically from Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The complete version, the most popular version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the Babylonian version that's on 12 tablets, and Tablet 11 specifically deals with the flood. And so you don't have to read the whole Epic of Gilgamesh to read the flood story. So if you're interested in specifically the flood story and Mesopotamian descriptions of the flood, you can just read Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. For 6 days and 6 nights the winds blew. Torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. Tempest and flood raged together like warring hosts. When the 7th day dawned, the storm from the south subsided. The sea grew calm, the flood was stilled. I looked at the face of the world, and there was silence. All mankind was turned to clay. The surface of the sea stretched as flat as a rooftop. I opened a hatch, and the light fell on my face. Then I bowed low. I sat down, and I wept, the tears streaming down my face, for on every side was the waste of water. This one deals with a man who survives, whose name is Utnapishtim. Ziusudra is equal to Atrahasis, who's equal to Utnapishtim. They're basically all the same. So Gilgamesh goes and finds this man named Utnapishtim, and he wants to know how Utnapishtim has achieved immortality, basically. He's been alive for a very long time, but he still looks very young. And how is this possible? And so Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. And what's really cool about it is that it references the idea that before the flood, people lived a very, very, very long time. And you'll see this in different pieces of surviving Mesopotamian sources that state how before the flood, men lived for a very, very long time. But then after the flood, the lifespans of men decreased. Like in the Sumerian king list, for example, which is a historical documentation of the rulers in Mesopotamia. Well, the beginning of it talks about the kings who first ruled in Mesopotamia, and their not lifespans, but the time that they were in power was very long, like 36,000 years, 24 something thousand years. Like they ruled for very, very long periods of time. But then towards the end of it, I'll just read it to you because I did mark it. So at the end of the very first section of the Sumerian king list, it says, in 5 cities, 8 kings. They ruled for 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. When the Sumerian king list continues, the kings that are ruling after the flood has happened ruled for much shorter periods of time. That also perpetuates this idea, which you see in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Atrahasis, that after the flood, the lifespans of men decreased. So those are the 3 flood stories that you can read if you're interested, because I think it's just really cool to read about, and so those are the ones I recommend. The next section that I have is called the Akkadian Empire section. So the Akkadian Empire, specifically Sargon the Great, he would really seem to fascinate the Mesopotamians until the end of the Mesopotamians. I mean, he's still fascinating today, right? But he was kind of always looked up to as a pinnacle of kingship. And so you would have kings later on down the line looking to him for inspiration, and there was even a king during the Neo-Assyrian Empire who named himself after Sargon. And I just thought that the literature surrounding different Akkadian people, was really cool. So I have a few things that I'll mention in this Akkadian section that deal with Sargon the Great, and then another Akkadian Empire ruler, Naram-Sin. And then also the first one that I'm going to talk about, though, is a daughter of Sargon the Great known as Enheduanna. Enheduanna is her Sumerian name, so I don't know what her real name would have been. I don't think anyone knows. But the name that she adopts is Enheduanna. So when Sargon the Great becomes king of all of Mesopotamia, he appoints his daughter Enheduanna to be the end priestess of so the highest priestess at And so she would become the end priestess of the god Nana, because he was the patron deity of And so she kind of would stand in as the human wife of Nana. And this was probably, obviously, a political move to better secure power by having one of his own family members move down to where the Sumerians are, this place that he's conquered, and to establish herself there. And again, she even changed her name to a Sumerian name and becomes one of the most powerful people in the city of And the reason why Enheduanna is, I guess, really cool is that she is the first person in all of Mesopotamia, and I think she might even be the first in the world. Don't quote me on that, not positive, but she might be like the first person ever to basically identify herself as the author of what she's written. And of course, there's obviously a lot of, speculation if she actually wrote those things herself or if other people wrote them and attributed it to her. So obviously we can't know. And some people do seem to really stress this, but I'm not really sure why, because I think that can be said for all literature that comes down the line where the author identifies themselves, but no one really seems to make such a big deal about it. So in terms of if Enheduanna actually wrote these pieces of writing, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. I think even if whether she did write them or not, I think it is a clear testament to her power and influence that she had, because they do know that she did historically exist and that she was actually the priestess, the end priestess at And so I think that it really is a testament to both her power and the power of the original family of Sargon the Great, that she was able to have so many hymns and songs and writings attributed to her. Most of her writings are hymns and songs to Inanna. So I know that she is the high priestess of Nana, but all of her hymns that are the longest, the most surviving, the most popular, they are written to Inanna, not Nana, okay? And specifically with a writing called The Exaltation of Inanna, which is probably the work from her that I would most recommend, because it gives a detail of an account of something that happened in her life. So in The Exaltation of Inanna, she describes how, and I presume this is after the death of Sargon the Great, she gets pushed out of the temple, out of her position of the end priestess at You see her filling all these lines with praise to Inanna, begging her and appealing to her to please help her in her isolation, in her being cast out from the city. And so the Exaltation of Inanna is really cool, because not only do you see Enheduanna identifying herself, but you also see her giving clues to something that's actually happening in her life. I'll read you a part of the Exaltation of Inanna where she is identifying herself. I, Enheduanna, the end priestess, entered my holy Shipar in your service. I carried the ritual basket and intoned the song of joy. But funeral offerings were brought, as if I'd never lived there. I approached the light, but the light was scorching hot to me. I approached that shade, but I was covered with a storm. My honeyed mouth became venomous. My ability to soothe moods vanished. And so you can find a lot of hymns where at some point in the hymn, you will see her say, I, Enheduanna, such and such. And so she's identifying herself as the author of that writing. And I think it's really cool. Next, I'm going to tell you 2 different pieces of writings that I recommend you read that are in correlation to Sargon the Great. And both of these have to deal with how Sargon came to power and basically his origins. The first one is known as the birth legend of Sargon, or just the legend of Sargon. And this one probably will sound familiar. I'll read a part of it to you so that, let's see, keep your ears open and see if it sounds, something about this story sounds familiar to you, okay? Sargon, the mighty king, the king of Akkad am I. My mother was lowly, my father I did not know. My lowly mother conceived me. In secret she brought me forth. She placed me in a basket of reeds. She closed my entrance with bitumen. She cast me upon the rivers, which did not overflow me. I don't know why, it's just funny to me when these things sound familiar to like a biblical story. I don't know, I guess it's kind of cool, I don't know. But obviously that sounds familiar to Moses being not just placed, but being born in secret. And then his mother places him in a reed basket in the Nile River and casts him along the reed basket. But in this story with Sargon, he is not obviously in Egypt. So he is cast along the Euphrates River by his lowly mother. And he is eventually found by a man named Aki. He is identified as an irrigator. And he finds Sargon and basically adopts him as his son and then raises him. So I guess it's used to kind of make him seem more magnificent because he wasn't born into a royal family. Like, his father was not a king, right? He comes from these beginnings where he is born of a lowly mother. He doesn't even know his father, and he is basically adopted by someone who's an irrigator. And even despite all of that, he's able to rise to such heights of power. Now, the birth legend of Sargon is quite small. It's not very long at all. Like, it's really short. So the next one that I recommend is a little bit longer, and it is called Sargon and Ur-Zababa. Again, it describes Sargon as coming from humble beginnings. So Sargon is identified as the cupbearer of the king Ur-Zababa, who is king of Kish at the time. And Ur-Zababa starts having these terrifying dreams. And then Sargon also has a terrifying dream where he sees Ur-Zababa being drowned in blood. When he tells Ur-Zababa this, Ur-Zababa is terrified. I mean, he was already terrified, but now he's even more terrified, and so he starts finding ways to have Sargon killed. The ending of the story, I don't think, has been found. We don't know the end of the story, but based on historical evidence, we can assume the end of the story. So historically, we know that Sargon the Great does end up conquering, overthrowing, I guess, Ur-Zababa and taking over Kish, and then taking over all of Akkad, so unifying the Akkadians. And then once he's done this, he goes south and defeats, at the time, Lugal-Zaggisi, who had conquered a ton of city-states in Sumer. And so he goes down south and defeats Lugal-Zaggisi, and then eventually takes control of all of southern and northern Mesopotamia. So I think that these 2 stories, the birth legend of Sargon and the Sargon and Ur-Zababa, I think they're really cool because they describe these beginnings of a figure that kind of becomes legendary. And the last story that I have for this Akkadian section is called The Curse of a God. So after the death of Sargon, you have his son Rimush, who becomes ruler, and then he dies, most likely assassinated, right? And then his brother, so one of Sargon's other sons, named Manishtushu, he becomes ruler, and then one of Manishtushu's sons, I mean, I don't know how many sons he had, but a son of Manishtushu named Naram-Sin becomes ruler after him, and he's the 4th ruler of the Akkadian Empire. And it's basically after the death of Naram-Sin, so the end of the reign of Naram-Sin, where the Akkadian Empire really starts to decline. And it is with the ruler after Naram-Sin, don't remember his name, but this 5th ruler is when just everything falls apart and they get conquered and destroyed. So Akkad was the just to remind you, the capital city of the Akkadian Empire that Sargon had created. This story talks about the downfall of the Akkadian Empire, but specifically it talks about the city of Agad, right? And so it talks about the destruction of the city of Akkad. It basically puts all of the blame on Naram-Sin. It tells how the gods took away their favor from the city. So even though the story says that the gods just decide to quit their support of a god, it seems that what really escalates the downfall is that Naram-Sin has a dream. Naram-Sin saw in a nocturnal vision that Enlil would not let the kingdom of Agad occupy a pleasant, lasting residence, that he would make its future altogether unfavorable, that he would make its temples shake and would destroy its treasures. He realized what the dream was about, but did not put it into words and did not discuss it with anyone. And it's really what Naram-Sin does after this, that his reaction to this basically, that really angers the gods and causes them to want to completely destroy the city and send the Gutians after them. And so I think that this is also great because it shows you how the Mesopotamians believed the gods played such an integral part in their lives and in the progression and decline of cities. That is it for the stories that deal with 3 Akkadian figures, Enheduanna, Sargon the Great, and Naram-Sin. Alright, so the next section is going to be the Inanna / Ishtar, if you want, section, because she's my favorite of the gods and goddesses, so we're gonna have a whole section dedicated to Inanna. Enlil gave me the heavens and he gave me the earth. I am Inanna. He gave me lordship, he gave me queenship, he gave me battles and he gave me fighting. He gave me the storm wind and he gave me the dust cloud. He placed the heavens on my head as a crown. He put the earth at my feet as sandals. He wrapped the holy Ma garment around my body. He put the holy scepter in my hand. The gods are small birds, but I am the falcon. At your battle cry, my lady, the foreign lands bow low. When humanity comes before you in awed silence at the terrifying radiance and tempest, you grasp the most terrible of all the divine powers. Because of you, the threshold of tears is opened, and people walk along the path of the house of great lamentations. And 2 stories that I'll recommend if you want to see the kind of ambitiousness of her is Inanna and Enki, where she basically steals the Mies, the divine Mies, which are like, how do I explain them? They're like the essences of the universe, if you will, like different things in the universe, but she's able to trick Enlil and steal the Mies from him. And then the other one is Inanna and Ebhe, where you can really see her anger. She's very angry at a mountain for some reason, because it won't bow to her, whatever. So you see her become very angry. So you can read those 2, but the ones I'm going to focus on more deal with Inanna and Dunluzid. The story with Inanna that you will see very often is Inanna's descent to the netherworld or Ishtar's descent to the underworld. You can read both of them are different, but they deal with the same story. Inanna basically decides to go to the netherworld, and it's described as her deciding to go on the road whose traveler never returns. In terms of her reasoning, the only thing I can really guess is based on something it says later on. Enlil and Nanna will both later say that Inanna craved the great heaven and she craved the great below. So I'm guessing that the ambitiousness of Inanna compelled her to not only want to have dominion over everything above. It wasn't enough. It didn't satisfy her. She also wanted everything below. And don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it for you. So if you want to find out what happens to Inanna in the netherworld, then you could read the story if you want. And when it comes to Ishtar's descent into the underworld, again, this is the Akkadian version. In terms of which one I like better, I don't really know. I think one thing that I really do like about the Akkadian version is that there is quite a bit of detail about what happens when love leaves humanity and leaves Earth. There's no description of that in the Sumerian version. You can just read them both also. I recommend them both. Okay, the next story that I'll recommend has to do with Inanna's descent to the underworld, which is called The Death of Dumuzid or Dumuzid's Dream. In Inanna's descent into the underworld, something happened, okay? And Dumuzid gets taken to the underworld. He gets chased by demons, and you see this happen in a kind of more first-person account in Dumuzid's dream. So in Inanna's descent to the underworld, you know, it's kind of mentioned, whatever, but in Dumuzid's dream, you get a much more detailed account of Dumuzid being chased by demons and him attempting to escape being captured and killed by demons and taken to the netherworld. Dumuzid and Inanna are very, very commonly represented as fertility figures, not just for like human fertility, but like agricultural fertility. And so you can see the Dumuzid's dream and the Inanna descent stories as a representation of winter and summer. Because of the things that happen in these two stories, Dumuzid ends up having to spend half of the year in the netherworld. So I recommend Inanna's descent to the underworld or Ishtar's descent to the underworld and Dumuzid's dream or the death of Dumuzid. And if you want another story regarding how Dumuzid becomes Inanna's lover, like how she chooses him, you can read, it's called Dumuzid and Inkimdu. You can read that. And then there's also a ton of surviving hymns and songs, like quite a lot of hymns and songs that were written to both Inanna and Dumuzid, and they all have to do again with fertility. And you can read them if you want. They're quite I don't know how to describe them. They're kind of gross. I don't know what else to tell you. They're kind of nasty to me. There's a lot of imagery in these hymns and songs that correlates sexual love with agriculture. And I don't know, sometimes it's just kind of weird. Like, for example, there's a hymn where Dumuzid, I can't even say it. The next section is about someone who I've already mentioned, but it's about Gilgamesh. The most popular compilation of Gilgamesh stories is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Anytime that you pick up a book that's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, you're going to be reading the Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh existed way before the Babylonians. There's a lot of Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh. So even before the Epic of Gilgamesh, the stories of Gilgamesh had been being spread and talked about and written down throughout Mesopotamia way before that. In the historical records of Mesopotamians, Gilgamesh was cited as being a real person and actually ruling. He was listed in the Sumerian king list, and he was mentioned as being a ruler of the city of Uruk, which you'll also see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's talked about as being ruling the city of Uruk. Assyriologists don't know if he actually existed or not. I know that like in the Sumerian king list specifically, he was mentioned as ruling for, I think, 126 years, at least over 100 years. So these stories about Gilgamesh might have been based on a real person, and they might not have. No one knows. I can't tell you. But it's cool to know that he might have been a king that actually existed, and they created all these stories about him to remember him and kind of immortalize him. I'll read you the very beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian version, okay? I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. This was the man to whom all things were known. This was the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise, he saw mysteries and knew secret things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. He went on a long journey, was weary, worn out with labor. Returning, he rested, he engraved on a stone the whole story. When the gods created Gilgamesh, they gave him a perfect body. Shamash, the glorious sun, endowed him with beauty. Adad, the god of the storm, endowed him with courage. The great gods made his beauty perfect, surpassing all others, terrifying like a great wild bull. 2/3 they made him god, and 1/3 man. And honestly, out of all of the literature that I recommended, I would probably say the ones that I could recommend the most, if you are wanting something that reads more like a story, is probably the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then second, I would probably say the Enuma Elish. But if you want something that's more complete and you're not going to have to read a bunch of fragments, something that kind of reads more like a story as we see it today, then this Epic of Gilgamesh is probably my highest recommendation. And it's definitely, I think, the most popular work of Mesopotamian literature. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of the Epic of Gilgamesh just because it's old and it's like a classic. I mean, I think it's still fun to not know everything, you know, have some surprises. It basically starts out with Gilgamesh, and he's causing havoc to the people of Uruk, which is the city that he rules. And so they beg the gods for help. And so the gods send down a man named Enkidu. And him and Enkidu form this very, very strong bond. And the two of them will set out to defeat monsters, go on adventures, be strong and courageous. I think what makes the Epic of Gilgamesh really stand out in comparison to a lot of other literature from ancient Mesopotamia is the focus on humanity, because a lot of Mesopotamian stories, it's really just focusing on the gods more so, like they're really the most prominent parts, but the Epic of Gilgamesh really speaks a lot to humans and the fact of mortality, that we have to die and that we have to face death. I think it's interesting how focused it is on humans and human problems. I just think it's really interesting because I think that it definitely stands out in that regard, at least everything that I've read of Mesopotamian literature. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say about it. Again, I think it's probably the longest story out of everything that I've mentioned. I don't want to say anymore because I think it's just fun to experience it yourself, I guess. If you haven't already read it, I know it's a much more popular story, and hopefully knowing a bit more about Mesopotamia itself helps you appreciate the story more, I guess. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh and you want more Gilgamesh, because why wouldn't you? There are a lot of other stories that you can read, specifically Sumerian stories. Other stories that you can read are Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, the Death of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh in the Land of the Living. I've also seen it called Gilgamesh and Huwawa, Gilgamesh and the Aga of Kish. Something to note though with the Sumerian versions of Gilgamesh, dynamics are quite different than in the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh. In Sumerian stories, Enkidu is typically referred to as his servant or as his slave. So that bond, that friendship, don't expect it to really be there. They're still friends, you know, they're still buddies, but he's his slave, you know, it's not the same. His dynamic with him and Ishtar is also quite different. So if you want to read more Gilgamesh, you can do so. If you want to read about Gilgamesh's father, Lugubanda is also a ruler of Uruk, and he was the father of Gilgamesh. You can read two stories that talk about Lugubanda. That's Lugubanda and the Mountains, and then Lugubanda and the Anzu bird. The last section is debates. I had another title. Oh, debate / disagreements. You could just say debates, but the reason I put / disagreements is because honestly, they don't really read like debates to me. When I think of debates, I think of people are more calmly arguing, but the characters in these stories are not calmly arguing. So I think disagreement is, we need a little / disagreement, okay? I really like these two stories because they're really mean, and I think it's funny. The first one is called The Debate Between the Bird and the Fish. The fish? Well, yeah, it is a fish. This is Sumerian, and there's actually quite a few of these that are like this. So it's basically the bird and the fish are arguing about which one of them is more essential to the world, to humanity. It becomes violent. Like, they start to become very heated and very angry, and their argument, their debate apparently escalates into violence, and they end up having to go to the gods to ask for help. to be the judge and decide which one of them is right and wrong. So if you want to find out who's right and wrong, you can read this story. With your ugly voice, you frighten the night. No one can sleep soundly. Bird, get out of the marshes. Get this noise of yours off my back. Get out of here and into a hole on that rubbish heap that suits you. Chopped off beak and legs, deformed feet, cleft mouth, thin tongue. You utter fool. Dumb muddle-headed fish. Now the next story that I'll tell you about is... I can't remember their names. I'm sorry. I gotta look at it. Okay. The disputation between Enkimensi, and Gurnishag. This is a debate between two scribal students, and they're basically telling each other how ugly their handwriting is and how bad they are at being a scribe. You dolt, numbskull, school pest, you illiterate, you Sumerian ignoramus, your hand is terrible. It cannot even hold the stylus properly. It is unfit for writing and cannot take dictation. And yet you say you're a scribe like me. I just think when it comes to debate writings by the Sumerians, they knew what they were doing. If you want to get a better idea, understand the vibe a bit more of scribes, I have some that I read that I can recommend to you if that's what you're interested in. Scribe and his perverse son, discussion between an ugala and a scribe, a hymn to Nisaba, a supervisor's advice to a young scribe, and a letter from Nabi Enlil to Ilum Pazara. Now, I know I said that was the end, my last section, but I just have an honorable mention. And my honorable mention is a lamentation on the fall of Ur. Actually, I wrote down lamentation of the destruction of Ur. Same thing. Basically, same thing. So this is the end of Ur 3, the third dynasty of Ur. This is a lamentation on that. For me, reading it, I felt such a emotional understanding of people that lived so long ago, because I think especially the farther back you go in history, the harder it is to feel connected to them. And I feel like it doesn't even have to be that far back in history to feel a disconnect. Like, I'm reading about the end of the third dynasty of Ur and all this. It really reminds me and gives me insight into what that must have been like. And so I really like it because of that, and I will finish the literature section, finish the video, actually. I will end this whole video. This is the end of the video. I'm ending the video with a quote from The Fall of Ur 3, the end of the power of the Sumerians, my friends. O my queen, your city weeps before you as its mother. Ur, like the child of a street which has been destroyed, searches for you. The house, like a man who has lost everything, stretches out the hands to you. How long, pray, will you stand aside in the city like an enemy? O Mother Ninkol, how long will you hurl challenges in the city like an enemy? Although you are a queen beloved of her city, your city you have abandoned.